In the quiet comfort of their own backyard in Oakland, the Robinson family was about to enjoy a long-awaited housewarming barbecue until an unexpected visitor arrived. What started as a routine gathering with neighbors and friends spiraled into confrontation when Elaine Whitfield, self-appointed neighborhood watchdog, demanded to see their IDs. Marcus Robinson wasn't just another homeowner. As a tech executive and grandson of long-displaced residents, he had fought tirelessly to reclaim his family's place in this neighborhood. His wife, Zora, a civil rights attorney, had spent years dismantling the very kind of bias now unfolding before them. When Elaine called the police, convinced the Robinsons were trespassing on their own property, she had no idea she was challenging the wrong family. With calm precision, Zora began recording. Marcus activated their newly installed security cameras, and the Robinsons set in motion an unexpected reckoning. What began as a petty power trip would become a community-wide scandal. The entire neighborhood, and soon the entire internet, would never forget the day Elaine Whitfield met the wrong family and learned that not every door she tried to shut would stay closed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Robinson stood on a ladder in the backyard of his newly renovated Victorian home, securing the final camera of their security system under the ornate eaves. The morning sun caught the polished brass fixtures they'd painstakingly restored, casting warm reflections across the yard where his children, Amara and Isaiah, arranged chairs for the afternoon's barbecue. "Just about done," Marcus called down to Zora, who was arranging platters on the outdoor table they'd selected specifically for entertaining. "Our digital guardians are officially on duty." Zora looked up, shielding her eyes from the sun. "Good. Though I'm still not sure if we're keeping people out or documenting who comes in." Her voice carried the measured tone she used in court, but Marcus caught the underlying tension. As a civil rights attorney, his wife had seen too many cases where even the most innocuous situations could escalate. "Both," Marcus said, climbing down and folding the ladder. "That's the purpose of boundaries. They work two ways." He surveyed their backyard, the restored deck, the heritage roses they'd salvaged, the century-old oak that had somehow survived decades of Oakland's evolution. This place was more than a home. It was reclamation. His grandparents had lived 3 blocks away until the first wave of urban renewal had displaced them in the 1970s. "I can't believe we're actually here," he said, his voice suddenly thick. "Granddad would have never thought it possible." Zora came beside him, resting her head against his shoulder. "He'd be proud, not just of the house, but what you've built to get here." "What we've built," Marcus corrected. His tech executive salary might have provided the down payment, but Zora's strategic mind had found the property, navigated the complex purchase from absentee investors, and structured the renovation loans. The sound of the doorbell interrupted them. "First arrivals," Zora said, smoothing her dress. "Remember, today is about celebration, not vindication." "I know." Marcus nodded, taking a deep breath. "But it can be both." "The wiring was a nightmare," Marcus explained to the small group gathered around the grill, gesturing with his spatula. "Original knob and tube throughout, and the previous owners had spliced in modern wiring in the most terrifying ways." "Disaster, waiting to happen," agreed Walter Simmons, nodding sagely. At 78, Walter was the neighborhood's unofficial historian and had been the first to welcome them with a potted Japanese maple and a handwritten history of the property. "This block has seen 5 house fires in my time, 3 from old wiring." Carmen Diaz, who had arrived an hour early with her children and immediately started helping in the kitchen despite Zora's protests, looked up from arranging condiments. "My apartment building is probably the same. The landlord never fixes anything until it breaks completely." "Which building are you in?" Walter asked. "The green one on Magnolia," Carmen replied, her voice quieter. Walter's eyebrows rose. "Ah, the old Stevenson place. That was a single-family home when I was a boy. They carved it into 8 units in the 90s. Marcus noticed Carmen's slight stiffening, the subtle vigilance of someone who had learned to be careful with personal details. He'd known Carmen since their children started school together, but it had taken months before she mentioned her undocumented status, and even longer before she accepted an invitation to their home. "Well, you and the kids are welcome here anytime," Marcus said warmly. "Isaiah has been talking all week about having Miguel over to see his new room." Carmen smiled, visibly relaxing. "Miguel, too. He's already asking when they can have a sleepover." The side gate opened, and Zora appeared escorting more guests, colleagues from her law firm and their families. The backyard was filling nicely, a diverse gathering that reflected their intentionally cultivated social circle. Marcus felt a swell of pride mingled with an uncertainty he couldn't quite name. A flash of movement caught his eye. A face at the upstairs window of the pale blue Victorian next door, quickly retreating behind cream-colored curtains. "That's Elaine Whitfield," Walter said quietly, following Marcus's gaze. "Been here about 15 years. Runs the neighborhood association." "We met briefly when we were moving in," Marcus said. "She seemed particular." Walter chuckled. "That's one way to put it. She bought when prices were just starting to climb. Divorced a few years back and didn't take it well. Used to have quite the social calendar, but that's tapered off." "We invited her today," Zora said, joining them with a tray of drinks. "She declined. Said she had prior commitments." Marcus nodded, turning his attention back to the grill. "Her loss. These ribs are going to be legendary." As afternoon mellowed toward evening, the gathering hit its stride. Children chased each other across the lawn while adults clustered in conversation pockets that shifted and reformed like slow-motion kaleidoscopes. The scent of barbecue smoke drifted upward, carrying with it the sounds of laughter and music, a carefully curated playlist that moved from jazz standards to neo-soul. Zora found Marcus by the cooler, refreshing his drink. "This is good," she said. "This feels right." "It does," he agreed, though his eyes briefly tracked toward the fence line. "Have you noticed we're the only black homeowners on this block now?" "I noticed," Zora said. "Walter mentioned there were 5 black families here in the 90s. And now it's just us, reclaiming space." Marcus made air quotes, echoing the phrase from their real estate agent's enthusiastic pitch. "Sometimes, I wonder if we're just playing into the whole cycle. Today we're the gentrifiers." "It's more complicated than that," Zora said, her lawyer's precision surfacing. "We're not displacing anyone. This house sat empty for 2 years while investors held it." I know, Marcus sighed. "It's just, being back in this neighborhood feels both familiar and foreign. When I visited my grandparents here, this was a working-class black neighborhood. Now it's ours," Zora interrupted firmly. "At least this small piece of it. That matters." Their moment was interrupted by a commotion from the children's area. Their daughter Amara came running over. "Dad, Isaiah and Miguel are climbing the oak tree and Miguel's stuck." Marcus handed his drink to Zora. "Duty calls." As he hurried toward the oak, he caught another glimpse of Elaine Whitfield now standing at her back fence, phone in hand, watching their gathering with undisguised interest. Their eyes met briefly before she turned away, disappearing back into her house. "Everything okay?" Walter asked, appearing at Marcus's side. "Fine," Marcus said, focusing on the tree where the boys were indeed stranded on a high branch. "Just neighborly curiosity." Walter hummed non-committally. "Some forms of curiosity come with complications." Marcus didn't have time to unpack that cryptic statement as he called up to the boys, "Hold tight, I'm coming up." He kicked off his shoes and approached the tree, mentally mapping his route up the sturdy branches. Behind him, the party continued, voices and music blending into the ambient soundtrack of their new beginning. The smoke from the grill drifted lazily over the fence line, carrying the aroma of their celebration into neighboring yards. As he reached for the first branch, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, not just by Elaine, but by the ghosts of this neighborhood's past and the uncertain specters of its future. This house, this yard, this gathering, it was more than a homecoming. It was a statement whether they intended it to be or not, and statements, however personal, rarely went unchallenged. Marcus was halfway up the oak tree reaching for Isaiah's outstretched hand when the distinctive sound of the side gate latch clicking open cut through the ambient party noise. He turned his head, still gripping the branch, to see a woman in pressed khakis and a powder blue polo shirt striding purposefully across his lawn. Elaine Whitfield moved with the confidence of someone who believed completely in her own authority. Her salt and pepper bob didn't shift as she marched toward the center of the gathering, her eyes scanning the crowd with unmistakable suspicion. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice slicing through conversations. "Who is responsible for this gathering?" Marcus carefully guided the boys to a lower branch. "Stay here," he instructed quietly, then dropped to the ground, landing softly on the grass. Years of customer management had taught him to recognize when a situation required his full attention. Zora was already moving toward Elaine, her posture shifting subtly from relaxed hostess to alert professional. "I'm Zora Robinson," she said, extending her hand. "This is our home. Is there something I can help you with?" Elaine ignored the outstretched hand. "This property is supposed to be vacant for renovations. The owners hired my real estate firm to monitor it. I need to see some identification immediately." Her voice carried across the yard, causing conversations to falter and heads to turn. Marcus approached, measuring his steps and keeping his expression neutral. "Ms. Whitfield, we met briefly when we moved in last month. I'm Marcus Robinson. We purchased this property and completed renovations 3 weeks ago." "I don't recall meeting you," Elaine said sharply, her eyes darting between them, "and I would know if this property had sold. I'm the neighborhood watch coordinator and I keep track of all transactions on this block." The party had fallen silent. From the corner of his eye, Marcus saw Carmen quietly gathering her children, ushering them toward the house with practiced efficiency. Her face had gone blank in the way that signaled deep anxiety. "We have every right to be here," Zora said, evenly, the slight edge in her voice recognizable only to those who knew her well. She had already slipped her phone from her pocket and was holding it waist-high, camera facing Elaine. "In fact, you're currently trespassing on our property." Elaine's face flushed. "I most certainly am not trespassing. I have a responsibility to this neighborhood. We've had break-ins, squatters. Squatters don't typically host barbecues with 30 guests," Marcus interjected mildly. "We'd be happy to show you our documentation, but I'm curious why you didn't simply ring the doorbell if you had concerns." Walter Simmons had made his way through the frozen tableau of guests. "Elaine," he said gently, "the Robinsons closed on this property nearly 3 months ago. I attended their signing celebration. They're the rightful owners." Elaine turned to Walter, her expression hardening. "With all due respect, Walter, your memory isn't what it used to be. This house was scheduled for at least 6 more months of renovation. The Historic Preservation Board hasn't even signed off on the exterior paint colors." "Because we expedited the process," Marcus explained, maintaining his calm. "We worked directly with the Historic Board to ensure compliance while accelerating the timeline. All permits are in order." Elaine's eyes narrowed as she surveyed the property. "Well, I'll need to see proof of ownership and those permits. Right now, the historic character of this neighborhood is protected by covenant, and as a resident for 15 years, I take that very seriously." Zora had been filming the entire exchange. Now she spoke with precise clarity. "Ms. Whitfield, you entered our property without permission, disrupted a private gathering, and are now demanding documentation in a manner that has no legal standing. You're welcome to contact the county assessor's office during business hours if you have questions about property ownership." "I don't need to be told about legal standing," Elaine snapped. "My ex-husband is a judge. I know exactly what my rights are as neighborhood watch coordinator." The mention of her ex-husband seemed to fuel her indignation. She pulled out her phone. "If you can't produce documentation, I'll need to report this. We've had issues with unauthorized gatherings in vacant properties." Marcus could see the security camera above the gate blinking its red light, capturing everything. He felt a familiar weight settle in his chest. The burden of having to be poised and controlled while being treated as suspicious in spaces he had every right to occupy. Ms. Whitfield, he said, his voice deliberately gentle. We're having a housewarming with our friends and family. I'm happy to show you our deed tomorrow when our guests have left. For now, I'd ask you to respect our privacy. Elaine's fingers were already tapping at her phone screen. That's not acceptable. For all I know, you could be gone by tomorrow. The responsibility of neighborhood watch is not to harass legitimate homeowners, Zora interjected, her professional calm beginning to fray. Neighborhood watch grants you no special authority to demand identification from private citizens on their own property. Several guests had begun gathering their belongings, the celebration's atmosphere thoroughly punctured. Marcus saw Carmen, watching anxiously from the kitchen window, her children's faces visible behind her. Walter tried again. Elaine, I was here when they moved in. Marcus's grandparents used to live in this neighborhood. He grew up visiting. That's completely irrelevant, Elaine cut him off. Past connection doesn't establish current ownership. She raised her phone to her ear. Yes, I need to report. Trespassers at 1837 Magnolia Street. A large group has accessed a property that's supposed to be vacant for renovation. She paused, listening. Yes, I'll hold. A collective tension rippled through the gathering. Marcus heard his son's worried voice from the tree. Dad, what's happening? Before he could answer, Zora stepped forward, her attorney's training fully engaged. Ms. Whitfield, you are currently making a false report, which is a criminal offense in California. We have owned this property for 3 months. The deed is recorded with the county. We have completed permitted renovations. You are trespassing on our property and disrupting our peaceful gathering. Elaine covered the phone's microphone. I'm doing my duty to this neighborhood, she hissed. Do you know how much property values have dropped when homes are vandalized? We've worked too hard maintaining standards here to let... She stopped abruptly, seeming to realize what she was about to say. Marcus felt a cold clarity descend. To let what, Ms. Whitfield? To let families like mine move in? That's not what I meant, Elaine said quickly, her eyes darting around at the watching faces. This has nothing to do with... I would have done exactly the same regardless of who... Into the microphone, she suddenly said, Yes, I'm still here. There appear to be squatters or unauthorized persons hosting a large gathering at the Victorson property that's under renovation. There are children present. I'm concerned for safety with the construction conditions. Marcus felt a surge of anger burn through his practiced restraint. End that call immediately, he said, his voice quiet but carrying unmistakable authority. You're putting my family and guests at risk with false accusations. I'm putting no one at risk by ensuring neighborhood safety, Elaine retorted, then spoke into the phone again. Yes, that's right, 1837 Magnolia. Walter had moved closer to Marcus. Son, the cameras are getting all this, he said softly. Remember that? Marcus nodded slightly, acutely aware of the recording devices. Zora's phone, their security cameras, the witnesses. He'd learned long ago the precious value of documentation, how it could transform a moment of injustice from subjective experience to objective evidence. Guests were quietly saying goodbyes, slipping away from the confrontation with apologetic glances. The joyful atmosphere of homecoming had been thoroughly shattered. Marcus saw Carmen duck away from the window when Elaine glanced toward the house. The police are sending an officer, Elaine announced with grim satisfaction, sliding her phone into her pocket. They take neighborhood watch reports very seriously. As they should, Zora replied, her voice steady. False reporting is a misdemeanor that can result in jail time. She hadn't stopped recording. Elaine's composure slipped for just a moment. I am performing my civic duty. When the Victorson family trusted my firm to monitor this property, the Victorsons sold this property to us, Marcus interrupted. Your information is outdated. Elaine folded her arms. We'll let the authorities sort this out. In the distance, the faint wail of sirens could be heard. The festive gathering had fully dissolved, leaving only a few close friends and family in awkward clusters around the yard. The food sat abandoned on plates, the music playing to no one. Marcus looked up to where his children still perched in the oak tree, their eyes wide with confusion and worry. He felt a surge of anger, not just at Elaine, but at how quickly their moment of joy had been poisoned, how their careful creation of safety had been violated. "Ms. Whitfield," he said quietly, "I want you to look around. Really look. Do you see what you've done here today?" Elaine's expression flickered, uncertainty crossing her features for the first time. "I've done my duty. This neighborhood has standards." "This neighborhood," Marcus cut in, "was where my grandparents lived until they were pushed out by urban renewal. This neighborhood was where I spent summers as a child. This neighborhood is where my family has finally returned, purchased a home legally, restored it lovingly, and tried to build community." His voice remained measured but carried an intensity that silenced Elaine momentarily. "And within hours of our first gathering," he continued, "you've invaded our space, questioned our right to be here, called armed authorities based on false assumptions, and made it abundantly clear how you see us." Elaine's face reddened. "This is not about... I would have done the same with anyone." "Would you?" Zora asked simply. The sirens grew louder, no longer distant. Marcus saw Carmen move away from the window, disappearing deeper into the house. Walter placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "The truth reveals itself in time," he said quietly. "Always has." The gathering had fragmented entirely now. The barbecue stood abandoned, wisps of smoke still rising from cooling coals. The yard that had minutes ago been filled with laughter and connection now felt like contested territory, a battleground of belonging. As the sirens drew closer, Marcus and Zora exchanged a glance, a moment of silent communication born from years together navigating spaces that weren't designed to welcome them. In that look was resigned recognition, strategic assessment, and underneath it all a deep current of protective fury. The celebration was over. Now it was about survival, documentation, and the careful navigation of systems that could turn against them at the slightest misstep. The sirens stopped, replaced by the sound of car doors slamming just beyond their fence. Last edited just now. The gate latch clicked again, this time with purposeful authority. Officer Miguel Ramirez entered first, his partner Officer Chen following, closely behind. Both wore body cameras that winked with tiny red lights, mechanical eyes capturing everything they saw. Officer Ramirez scanned the scene with the efficient assessment of someone who had responded to countless neighborhood disputes. "Afternoon, folks," he said, his tone professional but weary. "We received a call about a potential trespassing situation." Elaine Whitfield stepped forward immediately. "Yes, officer. I'm Elaine Whitfield, Neighborhood Watch Coordinator for Magnolia Historic District. I reported unauthorized use of this property, which is supposed to be vacant for renovations." Marcus caught the slight tightening around Officer Ramirez's eyes, the subtle tell of a first responder who already recognized the nature of the call. Before Elaine could continue, Zora moved forward, a manila folder appearing in her hands as if conjured. "Officer Ramirez," she said, her voice clear and measured. "I'm Zora Robinson. This is our home. We have owned it for 3 months. Here is our deed, certificate of occupancy, and completed renovation permits." She opened the folder with practiced precision. Marcus wasn't surprised she had these documents readily accessible. Zora's professional life had taught her the value of preparation. Officer Ramirez glanced at the papers, then at his partner. "Officer Chen, would you speak with Ms. Whitfield separately? I'll talk with the homeowners." Elaine bristled visibly at the word homeowners, but allowed herself to be guided toward the side yard by Officer Chen. As they moved away, Marcus heard her begin, "I've lived in this neighborhood for 15 years, and I can assure you..." Officer Ramirez turned his attention fully to Marcus and Zora. "Let me just verify these documents," he said, examining the papers Zora had provided. His eyes scanned them efficiently, occasionally glancing up at the property, making visual confirmation of the address and details. "These all appear to be in order," he said after a moment. "Can I ask what happened today?" Marcus was aware of the remaining guests watching from various points around the yard, of Carmen hovering in the kitchen doorway, and of the neighbors, who had begun to emerge from adjacent houses, drawn by the police presence. "We were hosting a housewarming barbecue," he explained, keeping his voice steady. "Ms. Whitfield entered our property uninvited through the side gate, demanded identification, refused to believe we were the homeowners, and called the police despite multiple assurances that we legally purchased and renovated this house." Officer D. Ramirez nodded, making brief notes. "Is this your first interaction with Ms. Whitfield?" "We met briefly when we moved in," Marcus said. "It was a brief introduction. She seemed surprised." "We've had no issues until today," Zora added, her attorney's precision evident. "Our security cameras captured the entire interaction, including her unauthorized entry onto our property." Officer Ramirez glanced up at the cameras mounted discreetly under the eaves. "Those working?" "Yes," Marcus confirmed. "Installed them myself this morning." A flicker of appreciation crossed the officer's face. Smart. He looked around at the half-eaten food, abandoned drinks, and dissipating party atmosphere. "I'm sorry about your gathering." The simple acknowledgement, so different from the defensiveness they'd often encountered from authorities, caught them both off guard. Marcus felt a tension he hadn't realized he was holding ease slightly. "Officer," Zora said, her voice lower now, "our friend Carmen Diaz is inside with her children. She's concerned about police involvement. Her children are U.S. citizens, but her own status is complicated." Officer Ramirez's expression remained neutral, but he gave a small nod. "I'm here responding to a property dispute. That's my only focus today." The message was clear, and Marcus felt a surge of gratitude. Not all officers would have offered that implicit reassurance. Across the yard, Elaine's voice had risen. "This is absurd. I was performing my duty as neighborhood watch coordinator, if you had any idea how hard we've worked to maintain property values." Officer Chen's response was too quiet to hear, but Elaine's indignant reaction suggested it hadn't supported her position. Walter Simmons had approached Officer Ramirez, moving with the careful deliberation of his age. "Officer, I can confirm the Robinsons purchased this property. I've lived in this neighborhood for over 50 years. I attended their closing celebration." Officer Ramirez turned to Walter with respect. "And you are, sir?" "Walter Simmons. I've been at 1823 Magnolia since 1968. There was quiet dignity in the statement, the weight of a half-century of residence. "Mr. Simmons, can you tell me about this neighborhood? Has there been a history of break-ins or unauthorized occupancy, as Ms. Whitfield suggested?" Walter's laugh held no humor. "Young man, I've watched this neighborhood transform from a red-line district where banks wouldn't give mortgages to black families, to an abandoned area after the manufacturing jobs left, to an up-and-coming district when artists moved in because it was affordable to whatever they're calling it now. Historic, desirable, curated." The last words carried a gentle mockery. "There have been vacant properties," he continued. "There have been squatters during the worst economic times. But in the last decade, the only issue has been how quickly homes sell and how much renovation happens before people move in." Marcus noticed more neighbors gathering at the edge of the property, watching the scene unfold. Some had phones out, recording the police presence from the sidewalk. What had begun as a private celebration had become public theater. Officer Ramirez had been listening intently to Walter. "Thank you, sir. That context helps." He turned back to Marcus and Zora. "I'll need to complete my report, but it's clear. You're the legal owners and were within your rights to host a gathering on your property." Across the yard, Officer Chen appeared to have concluded her conversation with Elaine, who stood with arms crossed, color high in her cheeks. The two officers conferred briefly, their voices too low to hear. Marcus glanced toward the house and saw Carmen still watching from the doorway, her children behind her. He gave what he hoped was a reassuring nod. Officer Ramirez approached them again. "Mr. and Mrs. Robinson, we've confirmed your legal ownership. There's no trespassing issue here. He hesitated, then added, "In these situations, we typically try to mediate a neighborhood resolution. Would you be open to that?" Zora's expression remained carefully neutral. "What specifically are you suggesting, officer?" "Ms. Whitfield has a certain perspective on her role in the neighborhood. We've suggested that an apology for the disruption might be appropriate." Before either could respond, Elaine's voice carried across the yard. "Apologize? For doing my duty? I was acting on the information I had. If they had properly introduced themselves to the neighborhood association..." Officer Chen said something to her in a low voice, causing Elaine to press her lips together tightly. "As you can see," Officer Ramirez said quietly, "mediation may not be productive today, but I want to be clear about what happened here. You were well within your rights. Ms. Whitfield entered your property without permission and made unfounded accusations." He paused, seeming to choose his next words carefully. "In my experience, these neighborhood adjustments can be challenging. I've responded to similar calls in the Fruitvale district where my parents live." The brief personal reference wasn't lost on Marcus. It was a subtle acknowledgement of shared understanding, of what it meant to navigate spaces where belonging was contested. Officer Chen had guided Elaine back to the central yard. "Ms. Whitfield has been advised about entering private property without permission," she said formally. "No criminal charges are being filed at this time." "That's it?" Elaine's voice rose. "Again, they host an unauthorized gathering that disrupts the entire neighborhood and there are no consequences." "Ms. Whitfield," Officer Ramirez said, his patience visibly thinning. "They are the legal owners of this property. There is nothing unauthorized about their gathering. They could, if they chose, file a complaint against you for trespassing." Elaine blanched slightly, then rallied. "I was performing my duty as neighborhood watch." "Neighborhood watch," Officer Ramirez interrupted firmly, "does not grant authority to enter private property or demand identification from citizens. It's about observation and reporting actual suspicious activity to authorities." A new voice called from the edge of the yard. "What's going on, Elaine? Why are the police here?" A small crowd of neighbors had gathered at the fence line, drawn by the spectacle. Marcus recognized a few faces from brief encounters during their renovation, the older couple from across the street, the young tech worker from 2 doors down, the woman with the golden retriever who walked by every morning. "There's been a misunderstanding," Officer Ramirez called back, his tone shifting to public address mode. "Everything's under control. Please return to your homes." No one moved. Marcus felt the weight of dozens of eyes recording, judging, interpreting. Their private moment of celebration had become a public exhibition of the very dynamics they had hoped to navigate quietly. "Is this really necessary?" he asked quietly, meeting Officer Ramirez's eyes. The officer gave a small shrug that communicated volumes. "Neighborhood disputes often draw an audience. People are curious. Or they're choosing sides," Zora murmured. Elaine had seized the opportunity of the expanded audience. "I was simply trying to protect our neighborhood's integrity," she announced, her voice pitched to Carrie. "Anyone would have had the same concerns seeing an unexpected gathering at a property that's been under renovation." Walter's voice cut through the yard, stronger than his age might suggest. "No, Elaine, not anyone, just you." A ripple moved through the watching neighbors. Officer Ramirez stepped forward, clearly deciding to end the scene. "All right. We've established that Mr. and Mrs. Robinson are the legal homeowners and were within their rights today. Ms. Whitfield, please refrain from entering their property without invitation in the future. Neighbors, there's nothing more to see here. Please respect this family's privacy." As he turned back to Marcus and Zora, he lowered his voice. "We'll be filing a report documenting this incident. If there are further issues, reference today's call." He hesitated, then added, "Those security cameras were a good investment. Documentation matters in these situations." Marcus understood the subtext perfectly. "Thank you, officer." The police prepared to leave, but the damage had been done. The celebration was irretrievably shattered. The remaining guests were gathering their belongings, speaking in hushed tones. The children had been shuttled inside, away from the spectacle. The food sat abandoned, the music silenced. Elaine left with a final pointed look at the house, her posture rigid with undiminished indignation. The neighboring audience gradually dispersed, though Marcus noted several lingering glances and ongoing quiet conversations as people returned to their homes. Once the officers had gone, Carmen emerged fully from the house, her children clustered around her. "I think we should go," she said quietly. "The children are tired." The excuse was transparent, but Marcus didn't challenge it. "Of course, thank you for coming. Next time will be—" He trailed off, unable to finish the platitude. As Carmen gathered her things, Zora touched her arm gently. "Are you okay?" Carmen's smile was strained. "Yes, I don't like police attention." "I understand," Zora said. "Text me when you get home safely." After Carmen and her children left, only Walter remained of the original gathering. He settled heavily into a chair, sighing. 53 years in this neighborhood, and some things change while others stay exactly the same. Marcus began mechanically clearing plates, needing physical activity to process what had happened. "Has she done this before, Elaine?" Walter considered the question. "Not exactly this, but Elaine has appointed herself guardian of a certain vision of this neighborhood. When the Murphys painted their door purple last year, she circulated a petition. When the Lee family installed solar panels, she filed a complaint with the historic board." "But this felt different," Zora said, joining them with a glass of wine she clearly needed. "It was different," Walter confirmed, "and we all know why." They sat in silence for a moment, the afternoon sun highlighting the abandoned celebration around them. What should have been a joyful milestone had become something else entirely, a stark reminder of invisible boundaries that no property, deed could overcome. Inside the house, the security system hummed quietly, its cameras having captured every moment of the confrontation in high definition. Zora took a long sip of her wine, her expression shifting from exhaustion to something more resolute. "That footage," she said finally. "We should review it." Marcus recognized the tone, the same one she used when preparing for a significant case. "You're thinking about more than just reviewing it." "I'm thinking about consequences," Zora replied, meeting his eyes directly. "I'm thinking about what happens when these moments remain private grievances versus public record." Walter watched them both with knowing eyes. The digital age changes things. What once disappeared into conflicting accounts now lives forever in pixel-perfect detail. "For better or worse," Marcus said. "Sometimes better," Zora responded, her determination solidifying. "Sometimes worse, but always more truthful than letting others control the narrative." As the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across their disrupted celebration, Marcus knew they stood at a crossroads. What had happened today could remain a private indignity, one of countless such moments absorbed by families like theirs across the country, or it could become something else, something public that neither they nor Elaine could fully control. "Let's go inside," he said finally. "We need to check the footage while it's still fresh." As they walked toward the house, Marcus glanced back at their yard, the oak tree where his children had played, the grill where he had proudly served, his family's recipes, the tables where connection had flowered briefly before being severed. This property was theirs by legal right. Yet today had proven that ownership existed in multiple dimensions: legal, social, historical, emotional, and claiming space in one dimension didn't guarantee recognition in the others. Inside, the security system waited, its digital memory holding perfect recall of everything that had transpired, evidence that could remain private or become irrevocably public with the touch of a button. The Robinson family gathered in their living room, the security system's monitor casting a blue glow across their faces. The footage was startlingly clear, high-definition images capturing Elaine's unwelcome entry, her confrontational stance, the disruption of their celebration, and the arrival of police. The audio picked up every word with unsettling precision. "It's all there," Marcus said quietly, pausing the playback. Every assumption, every accusation. Amara and Isaiah sat on the floor, watching with solemn expressions that seemed too mature for their young faces. 12-year-old Amara hugged her knees to her chest. Why didn't she believe we live here? The simple question hung in the air, laden with implications neither parent wanted to unpack for their children just yet. Sometimes people make judgments based on what they expect to see, not what's actually there, Zora finally answered, choosing her words carefully. Marcus looked at his family, gathered in this home they had worked so hard to claim. The day that should have cemented their place in the neighborhood had instead highlighted their precarious position within it. What are we going to do with this? He asked, gesturing to the screen. Zora's expression was contemplative, the attorney in her weighing options and potential consequences. We have choices. We can file it away, document the incident, but keep it private. We can make a formal complaint, send it to the police department, perhaps the neighborhood association. Or, Marcus prompted, knowing there was more. Or we can share it, Zora said simply. Let others see what happened. Let the footage speak for itself. Go public, Marcus said, understanding immediately. Social media? Zora nodded. With a simple statement of fact, no embellishment needed. They fell silent, both considering the implications. Making the footage public would be irreversible, a step that would transform a private indignity into a public narrative neither of them could fully control. The children, Marcus said after a moment. We can blur their faces, Zora replied. Carmen's too, for her protection. Marcus turned to their children. We need to have a family talk about something important. What happened today was wrong. Mom and I are considering sharing the video of what happened so that other people can see it. Like on TikTok? Isaiah asked. More like a statement, Zora explained. If we share this, people might recognize our house or even us. There might be attention we don't want. Is it like when you take cases to court, Mom? Amara asked. To make things fair? Zora smiled sadly at her daughter's simplification. Something like that. But court has rules and procedures. The internet doesn't. I think you should show people, Amara said firmly. Ms. Whitfield was mean, and she shouldn't get away with it. From the mouth of babes, Marcus thought. He met Zora's eyes over their children's heads, a silent communication passing between them. Let's sleep on it, he suggested. Today has been difficult enough. But as the children went to bed and the house grew quiet, Marcus found Zora in their home office editing the footage, blurring faces, trimming it to the essential confrontation. You've decided, he said, not a question. I keep thinking about Carmen's face when the police arrived, Zora replied without looking up. About Walter having to defend our right to be here after 50 years in this neighborhood. About our children watching all of it. She turned to face him. If we stay silent, we're teaching our children that this is just something to endure. That there are no consequences for treating people this way. Marcus sat beside her, watching the silent footage play on her screen. And if we speak up, we're teaching them that standing up has consequences too. Not all of them predictable or fair. Yes, Zora agreed. But at least they'll know we didn't just accept it. Marcus nodded slowly. Do it. But keep it factual. No commentary, no accusations. Zora's fingers moved over the keyboard, typing a brief clinical description. Today, our family hosted a housewarming barbecue at our newly renovated Oakland home. This is what happened when a neighbor decided we didn't belong here. She pressed upload. Now we wait, Marcus said. But they didn't have to wait long. By morning, the video had been viewed over 200,000 times. By noon, it had surpassed 1 million. Major news sites had picked it up, embedded it in articles with headlines like "Another Karen confrontation goes viral in Oakland," and "Homeowners harassed at their own barbecue." The term Oakland Karen was trending nationally by early afternoon. Their phones began ringing incessantly. Local reporters first, then national outlets. Email requests poured in. Direct messages flooded their social media accounts. "Good Lord," Marcus muttered, silencing his phone after the 15th call in an hour. "I didn't expect this." Zora looked both vindicated and unsettled as she scrolled through the comments on the video. "I expected attention, but not this." The doorbell rang, and Marcus peered through the security camera to see a news van parked at the curb, a reporter and cameraman on their porch. "It's beginning," he said. Across the fence, Elaine Whitfield was experiencing the other side of viral infamy. Elaine stared at her phone in horror, watching herself through the unforgiving lens of the security camera. Seeing her actions from this external perspective was disorienting. Her certainty appeared as aggression, her concern as hostility. The comments beneath the video were merciless. "Watch another entitled white lady call cops on black homeowners. The audacity to demand ID from people on their own property. This is what systemic racism looks like in real time." Her phone had been chiming with notifications since dawn. Messages from friends, colleagues, even distant acquaintances who'd recognized her. "Elaine, is this you? Please tell me it's not. Just saw you on the morning news. What were you thinking? The university is asking questions. You need to call me ASAP." That last message from her department chair had sent a chill through her. Her position as an alumni relations coordinator at Berkeley had always been a point of pride, a connection to prestige that had sustained her through her divorce and the subsequent downsizing of her social circle. Now the university's Twitter account had posted, "We are aware of a video circulating involving one of our staff members. We take these matters seriously and are investigating the situation." The doorbell rang, startling her so badly she dropped her phone. Through the peephole, she saw a woman with a microphone and a man with a camera. She stepped back, heart pounding. This couldn't be happening. She'd done nothing wrong. She was protecting the neighborhood. Anyone would have done the same. Wouldn't they? At Berkeley, James Whitfield was sitting in the student union when his phone erupted with texts from friends. "Dude, isn't this your mom? Whitfield, your mom is trending for all the wrong reasons." "Holy shit, James, what is your mother doing?" He clicked the link with growing dread, watching the footage unfold with a sickening mixture of recognition and alienation. The woman on the screen was unmistakably his mother, but her actions seemed like those of a stranger. James had spent the past 2 years immersed in social justice courses, attending rallies against police brutality, writing papers on systemic racism. He'd argued passionately with his mother over dinner during breaks about these very issues. And now she had become the embodiment of everything he opposed, weaponizing her privilege, calling police on a black family for simply existing in their own space. "Fuck," he muttered, gathering his backpack quickly. He needed to go home. Now. Carmen Diaz watched the video spread with increasing anxiety. Though her face was blurred, she recognized herself in the background, ushering her children inside when the police arrived. What if someone recognized her anyway? What if immigration services saw the footage? What if they came looking? Her phone buzzed with a text from Zora. "Are you okay? We blurred faces but wanted to check on you." She typed back with shaking hands, "I'm scared. What if they come for me because of this?" Zora's response was immediate. "Come to the house, we'll figure this out together." Walter Simmons found himself suddenly popular with reporters seeking context about the neighborhood's history. He sat on his porch rocker, speaking carefully to a young journalist from the local paper. "This street has seen everything. Redlining in the 50s, white flight in the 60s, abandonment in the 70s, crack epidemic in the 80s, first wave of gentrification in the 90s, tech boom pricing in the 2000s. Through all that, boundaries kept shifting. Who belongs, who doesn't?" He gestured toward the Robinson house where another news van had pulled up. What happened yesterday wasn't about a barbecue or renovations. It was about who gets to claim space without having to justify their existence in it. The reporter scribbled furiously. "Will you speak on camera for our 5 o'clock broadcast?" she asked. Walter considered this. "Maybe, but you need to understand something. This isn't just about 2 families. This is about a pattern playing out across this city for generations. By evening, the video had been viewed over 5 million times and had been featured on national news broadcasts. The Robinsons had disconnected their doorbell and drawn their curtains, trying to shield their children from the unexpected spotlight. "What have we done?" Marcus asked quietly, watching yet another news van cruise slowly past their house. "We, told the truth," Zora replied, though her voice held a note of uncertainty. "We just didn't anticipate how hungry people were to hear it." Their phones continued to buzz with messages, some supportive, others probing, many from friends and family concerned about their well-being. Marcus's company had called to check if he needed time off, and to quietly assess whether the publicity might affect their brand. Zora's law partners had expressed solidarity but also curiosity about how the exposure might impact their civil rights practice. Everyone, it seemed, had an angle. The children had been kept home from school after reporters had been spotted near the campus. Isaiah had asked innocently at breakfast, "Are we famous now?" "Not in a way we wanted," Marcus had answered honestly. A text message from Carmen appeared on Zora's phone. "I'm coming over, walking to avoid the news people." Minutes later, Carmen slipped through the side gate, looking around nervously before hurrying to the back door where Zora waited. "It's everywhere," she said once inside, her voice strained. "My sister in Los Angeles saw it on the news." "What? If someone recognizes me?" Before Zora could respond, Marcus's phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. He almost declined it until he saw the Berkeley area code. "Hello?" he answered cautiously. "Mr. Robinson? This is James Whitfield, Elaine's son." The young man's voice was tense. I just got home and saw everything. I wanted to call and I don't even know what to say except that I'm sorry." Marcus put the phone on speaker so Zora could hear. "James, thank you for calling," he said. "This situation has spiraled beyond what anyone expected. My mother is—" James hesitated. "She's not handling this well. The university has placed her on administrative leave pending an investigation. There are reporters camped outside our house." "We know," Zora said. "They're here too. I just wanted you to know that that what she did was—" James struggled to find the words. "I'm studying social justice at Berkeley. I understand what happened. I've been trying to talk to her about these issues for years." The raw pain in his voice was evident, the agony of someone caught between family loyalty and moral clarity. "We aren't looking to destroy your mother," Marcus said gently. "We just couldn't let what happened go unchallenged." "I understand," James replied. "I just don't know how to fix this." The question hung in the air unanswerable. Some boundaries, once crossed, couldn't be easily restored. "Would it help if we met?" Zora suggested. "Not for the cameras, not for social media. Just to talk." James was quiet for a moment. "Maybe, but not today. She's fragile right now. Everything she thought she was protecting, her reputation, her position, her standing in the community, it's all at risk. She doesn't understand why." "That's part of the problem," Marcus said. "I know," James replied simply. "Believe me, I know." After the call ended, the three adults sat in silence, each processing the unexpected connection. "He seems like a good kid," Marcus finally said. "Caught in a hurricane not of his making," Zora agreed. Carmen looked between them, her expression troubled. "What happens now?" Neither had an answer. The footage had taken on a life of its own, becoming a symbol in a larger cultural conversation about race, belonging, and the boundaries of neighborhoods in transition. The personal reality of their lives, their hopes for this home, their children's sense of security, their desire for community, had been subsumed into a broader narrative over which they had limited control. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across their yard where just 24 hours earlier they had been celebrating their homecoming. The oak tree stood silent, witness to the transformation of their private moment into public spectacle. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Walter. "National Civil Rights Organization reached out to me about your video. They want to make it part of a campaign. Told them to talk to you directly. This thing is bigger than our block now." He showed the message to Zora, whose expression grew contemplative. "We opened this door," she said. "Now we have to decide how far we walk through it." The doorbell rang again. Another reporter, another camera, another microphone seeking a sound bite to feed the insatiable appetite of the viral story machine. Marcus and Zora looked at each other, the weight of unexpected public responsibility settling on their shoulders. The boundary between private life and public narrative had been irreversibly crossed. The question now was whether any good might come from standing in this uncomfortable spotlight, and what it would cost them all to find out. 1 week after the video went viral, Marcus stood in the driveway at dawn, watching a security contractor install reinforced locks on their gates. The morning fog shrouded Oakland's hills, casting an ethereal glow over the neighborhood that had become both home and battleground. "We'll have the upgraded system online by afternoon," the contractor said, drilling another bolt into place. "Motion sensors, alert notifications, direct line to private security." Marcus nodded, his eyes tracking a slow-moving car that crept past their house for the third time that morning. Tourists or trolls? It was impossible to tell anymore. The Robinson family had received their fourth suspicious package yesterday, this one containing a crude doll with a noose. The police had added their address to priority response status after the first death threat arrived. Their Victorian dream home now felt like a fortress under siege. Inside, Zora sat at the kitchen island, sorting through emails on her laptop, while simultaneously scanning news alerts that mentioned their names. The children ate breakfast quietly, their normal morning chatter subdued by the new reality of homeschooling and limited outdoor time. "Berkeley's ethics committee wants us to participate in their investigation of Elaine," Zora said without looking up. "They're framing it as a restorative justice opportunity." "What does that mean exactly?" Marcus asked, pouring himself coffee. "They want us to meet with Elaine in a moderated setting to discuss the incident and potential remedies." Zora's tone was neutral, but Marcus could sense her professional interest battling with their family's need for privacy. "Do we want to do that?" he asked. Zora closed her laptop. "Honestly, part of me does. The attorney in me sees value in formal acknowledgement and institutional consequences, but the mother in me—" She glanced at their children. "The mother in me wants this to be over. I want our home to feel like home again." Amara looked up from her cereal. "Is Ms. Whitfield going to apologize to us?" The simple question highlighted the gap between institutional processes and personal healing, between public narratives and private lives. "I don't know, sweetheart," Marcus answered honestly. "But even if she does, it might not change how some people see us or treat us." Isaiah pushed his bowl away. "Can we go to the park today? I'm tired of being inside." The innocent request carried the weight of all they'd lost, the freedom to simply exist in their neighborhood without calculation or fear. "We'll see," Zora said, the phrase parents use when they can't promise yes, but don't want to say no. Marcus's phone buzzed with a calendar notification. Executive leadership meeting at 10 a.m. He'd been avoiding the office all week, working remotely to shield his family from the continued media attention. But his CEO had been insistent about today's meeting. "I have to go in," he said, the reluctance evident in his voice. "Are you sure that's wise?" Zora asked. "Not really," Marcus admitted, but Davis mentioned something about leveraging our unique position in this moment. I should find out what that means. Across the fence, Elaine Whitfield sat rigid at her dining room table as her son James paced the length of the room. The formal space, once a showcase for dinner parties that had gradually dwindled after her divorce, now felt like a witness stand. "Mom, you need to really watch the whole video," James insisted, gesturing to her untouched laptop. "Not just the clips, on the news, the entire interaction." "I lived it, James. I don't need to watch it," Elaine replied, though her voice lacked conviction. The past week had shaken her in ways she couldn't articulate. The university suspension, the canceled real estate listings, the whispers at her grocery store, the social media deluge. It was as if her carefully constructed life had been built on sand all along. James stopped pacing, his expression a mixture of frustration and anguish. You say you were protecting the neighborhood, but have you asked yourself what exactly you were protecting it from? A black family hosting a barbecue? Children playing in a yard? It wasn't about... Elaine began automatically, then stopped. The practiced defense felt hollow even to her own ears. It wasn't about what, Mom? James pressed. Race? Then why didn't you question the Petersons when they moved in last year? Or the Changs before them? Elaine stared at her hands, the diamond of her long-ago engagement ring catching light and dispersing it. Richard had taken everything else in. The divorce, their savings, their social circle, their retirement plans. But she'd kept this ring and this house. Both symbols of the life she'd fought to maintain even as it eroded beneath her. I was trying to protect what little control I have left, she admitted quietly. This neighborhood is all I have now. James sat beside her, his anger gentling. That's honest, at least. But Mom, protecting your sense of control can't come at the expense of other people's dignity and safety. I know that, Elaine said. Then more softly, I know that now. Her phone chimed with an email notification. The University Ethics Committee requested her presence for a mediated dialogue with the Robinsons. They want me to meet with them, she said, showing James the message. The Robinsons, at Berkeley. James read it quickly. This could be good, Mom. A chance to make amends. Elaine felt panic rising. In front of a committee? With my job on the line? How is that genuine reconciliation? It's a start, James said. And maybe they're as uncomfortable with all this as you are. Elaine glanced toward the window where her yard met the Robinsons, the boundary line that had once seemed so clear and was now irrevocably blurred. At his company's downtown Oakland office, Marcus sat across from CEO Davis Hamilton and the executive leadership team, increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. This is a unique opportunity, Davis was saying, animated, in a way Marcus rarely witnessed. The video has put a human face on issues our diversity initiative has been trying to address for years. We'd like to feature your experience in our upcoming campaign. Marcus maintained a neutral expression while internally recoiling. Feature my experience how exactly? A testimonial series, the marketing director explained, sliding a mock-up across the table. We're calling it Belonging in Every Space. Your story would be the centerpiece. The proposed design featured an artistic rendering of Marcus standing before his Victorian home, looking resolute. The tagline read, Our VP of Engineering knows what it means to defend his right to space. At Tech Fusion, we're creating environments where everyone belongs. Marcus stared at the image, a complex wave of emotions washing over him. You want to use what happened to my family to promote our company's diversity credentials? Davis leaned forward. Marcus, you've always said we need to be more than just talk on inclusion. This is our chance to take a public stand, to show we support our employees when they face discrimination. By commodifying my family's trauma? Marcus asked. Mildly, though he felt anything but mild. By turning a deeply personal violation into marketing material? The room grew uncomfortable, executives shifting in their ergonomic chairs. We thought you'd appreciate the support, the HR director said, confusion evident in her tone. We're trying to stand with you. Behind me would be fine, Marcus replied. Beside me would be supportive. This feels like standing on my experience to elevate the company's profile. Davis backpedaled immediately. That's not our intention. We value you as a leader, not as a symbol. Then maybe ask what support looks like to me, Marcus suggested, rising from his chair. Rather than assuming that turning my family's crisis into content is somehow helpful. As he left the building, Marcus felt the familiar weight of being seen through a racial lens first, his professional identity second. The very inclusion they claimed to champion still required him to be packaged in a way that served institutional needs. Carmen Diaz sat in the Robinsons' kitchen, hands wrapped around a mug of tea as she spoke quietly to Zora. I've missed 6 shifts. My supervisor is understanding, but... She shook her head. I can't afford this, but I'm afraid to go back. Has anyone recognized you? Zora asked. One customer thought she did but wasn't sure. My face is blurred, but people know I clean houses in this neighborhood. Carmen stared into her tea. My children haven't been to school all week. We're all hiding. Zora reached across the table to squeeze her friend's hand. I'm so sorry. We never intended for any of this to affect you. It's not your fault, Carmen said firmly. You did what you needed to do. But now I need to decide what I'm going to do. What do you mean? Carmen straightened her shoulders. The immigration advocacy group that reached out to you contacted me as well. They think my story, an undocumented person caught in this situation, afraid of police involvement, adds an important dimension. Zora's eyebrows rose. They want you to go public? They want to include my perspective anonymously at first, but they believe it could help the larger cause. Carmen's expression was a mixture of fear and resolve. I've spent years in the shadows, Zora. Maybe it's time my experience counted for something. That's incredibly brave, Zora said, but also incredibly risky. Everything about my life is risky, Carmen replied with a sad smile. At least this risk would be my choice. Officer Miguel Ramirez sat in his precinct's review room, watching body camera footage from the Robinson incident alongside his sergeant and a representative from Internal Affairs. Your response followed protocol, the IA officer said, pausing. The footage. But there's been some media scrutiny about why no citation was issued to Ms. Whitfield for false reporting or trespassing. Ramirez maintained a professional demeanor. I used my discretion based on the totality of circumstances. My priority was de-escalation and resolution. The optics aren't great, his sergeant commented, especially given the video's viral nature. Optics weren't my concern, Ramirez replied evenly. Public safety was. Escalating the situation with citations would have increased tensions in an already volatile neighborhood dynamic. The IA officer made notes. The department is updating response protocols for neighborhood dispute calls involving potential racial dynamics. Your experience would be valuable in that process. Ramirez recognized the olive branch being extended, a chance to channel this incident into procedural improvements rather than individual scrutiny. I'd be happy to contribute, he said, though privately, he wondered if any protocol could adequately address the complex history and power dynamics that had been at play that day. As evening fell, Walter Simmons's Victorian home filled with neighbors, some longtime residents, others relative newcomers, all drawn by his handwritten invitations to a neighborhood dialogue. We've become a spectacle, Walter said once everyone had gathered in his living room. People driving by to see the Karen house and the viral video family. That's not who we are or what this neighborhood should be known for. Heads nodded in agreement. The past week had disrupted everyone's lives to varying degrees. What's done is done, continued Walter. The video is out there. The news has told its version of events, but we still have to live next to each other. The question is, what kind of neighborhood do we want to be now? The resulting conversation revealed fracture lines that had existed long before the incident, but had remained beneath the surface. Tensions between old and new residents, concerns about gentrification, unspoken racial dynamics, differing visions of community. Has anyone actually spoken to the Robinsons or Elaine since this happened? Asked Mrs. Chen from across the street. A telling silence answered her question. That's where we need to start, Walter said. Not with social media statements or news interviews, but with direct conversation between neighbors. Marcus and Zora had been invited but had chosen not to attend, sensing that their presence might inhibit honest discussion. Elaine had been invited as well, but had sent James in her place. He sat quietly in the corner, absorbing the community's reaction to his mother's actions. After the meeting dispersed, James lingered to help Walter arrange furniture. Thank you for including us, he said, even if Mom couldn't face it yet. Walter regarded the young man thoughtfully. Your mother made a mistake, a public, hurtful mistake. But she's not the first person to act on unconscious bias, and she won't be the Last. That doesn't excuse it, James said quickly. No, it doesn't, Walter agreed. But understanding the context might help us move forward. Your mother lost her sense of security when your father left. The neighborhood became her identity, her safe space. So she tried to control it, James finished the thought, by policing who belongs and who doesn't. Precisely. Walter placed a hand on James's shoulder. The hard part now is helping her see that real security comes from connection, not control. Late that night, Marcus and Zora sat on their back porch, the children finally asleep after another day of contained activities and careful explanations. The security lights cast long shadows across the yard where their celebration had been so abruptly ended just over a week ago. The civil rights organization sent a formal proposal, Zora said, showing Marcus her tablet. They want to use our case as part of a national campaign on housing discrimination and neighborhood profiling. Marcus scanned the document. They're offering legal support, media training, security consultation, and a platform, Zora added, a chance to turn what happened to us into something that might help others. Marcus set the tablet down. Is that what we want? To become professional victims, professional activists? Is that how you see it? Zora asked, her tone gentle but probing. I don't know how I see it anymore, Marcus admitted. Part of me wants justice, not just for us, but for every family that doesn't have security cameras or legal knowledge or the privilege of being believed, but another part just wants our life back. Zora leaned her head against his shoulder. I'm not sure we get that life back. Not exactly as it was. No, Marcus agreed. That boundary's been crossed. Their conversation was interrupted by a notification on Zora's phone. The University Ethics Committee requesting their presence for a mediated dialogue with Elaine Whitfield the following week. They want an answer by tomorrow, Zora said. Marcus stared into the darkness where their property met Elaine's, the invisible line that had become a battleground now represented by sealed legal documents and viral video frames. If we go, he said slowly, what do we hope to achieve? Acknowledgement, Zora replied after consideration. Not just of what happened, but why it matters, and maybe some assurance that she understands enough not to do this to anyone else. And if we don't go, then we leave her consequences to the university and continue trying to rebuild our sense of home here without resolution. Marcus thought of the boundary line between their properties, how a fence marked its location but couldn't contain the human complexities that traversed it daily. Let's go, he decided. Not for the university's benefit or for some performative reconciliation, but because we live 30 feet from each other, because our children might play in the same parks, shop at the same stores. Because boundaries work best when they're acknowledged by both sides, Zora added, echoing his words from what felt like a lifetime ago. They sat in companionable silence, watching the fog roll in from the bay, shrouding the neighborhood in a temporary peace that masked the visible and invisible boundaries crisscrossing beneath it. The Equity and Inclusion Conference Room at Berkeley was designed for difficult conversations. The oval table encouraged eye contact, the lighting was calibrated to be warm without being dim, and the windows overlooked a carefully maintained garden rather than the bustle of campus. The neutral setting was meant to level power dynamics and facilitate honest dialogue. To Marcus, it felt like a theater set, too deliberately arranged to be authentic. Thank you all for agreeing to this. Restorative Justice Dialogue, began Dr. Lydia Chen, the university's lead mediator. Our goal today is not punishment, but understanding and healing. Marcus glanced at Zora, who sat beside him with the poised attention she brought to courtroom proceedings. Across the table, Elaine Whitfield looked smaller than he remembered. Her shoulders hunched slightly beneath a navy blazer that seemed chosen for its professional armor, rather than style. Beside her sat James, his protective posture toward his mother at odds with the occasional flash of frustration in his eyes. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Walter had been invited as a community elder, and he nodded solemnly from his place at the table's end. Two university administrators completed the circle, their presence a reminder that this was both a personal reckoning and an institutional proceeding. "We'll begin by establishing ground rules," Dr. Chen continued, gesturing to a whiteboard where a list had been pre-written. "One person speaks at a time. Focus on impact, not intent. Use I statements. Commit to confidentiality. Work toward repair, not punishment. Does anyone wish to add to these guidelines?" she asked. The room remained silent, each participant aware of the carefully constructed nature of this interaction. "Then let's begin with a moment to center ourselves," Dr. Chen said, her voice taking on the measured cadence of practiced facilitation. "Close your eyes if you're comfortable doing so and take 3 deep breaths." Marcus kept his eyes open, watching Elaine's face as she dutifully closed hers. The lines around her mouth had deepened since their confrontation, new tributaries, carved by stress and public scrutiny. "Now," Dr. Chen said after the ritual breathing, "I'd like to start by having each person share their experience of the incident and its aftermath, without interruption. Marcus, would you be willing to begin?" Marcus had prepared for this, rehearsing points with Zora the night before. Yet now, faced with the expectant faces around the table, he found himself setting aside his mental outline. "When I was installing our security cameras that morning," he began, "I was thinking about protection, not just from crime but from misunderstanding, from assumptions, from exactly what ended up happening." His voice remained steady, though he felt Zora's supportive shift beside him. "The barbecue was meant to be a reclaiming," he continued. "My grandparents lived in that neighborhood until they were pushed out. Coming back felt like closing a circle, healing something broken, and then..." He paused, meeting Elaine's eyes directly for the first time. "And then you walked into our yard and immediately assumed we didn't belong there." Elaine's gaze dropped to her hands. "The thing is," Marcus said, "it wasn't shocking. It wasn't even surprising. It was just familiar. Another moment in a lifetime of moments where I've had to prove my right to exist in spaces I've earned." He stopped, having said more than he'd planned but less than he felt. Dr. Chen nodded. "Thank you for that honesty, Marcus. Zora, would you like to share next?" Zora straightened imperceptibly. "As an attorney who specializes in housing discrimination, I recognized what was happening immediately. The legal term is hostile environment harassment, actions that interfere with a person's right to enjoy their dwelling based on a protected characteristic." Her professional language created momentary distance, but then her voice softened. "As a wife and mother, what I felt was violation. Our children witnessed someone challenging our most basic right to be safe in our own home. That's not something they'll forget." James shifted uncomfortably in his seat as Zora continued. "The aftermath has been complex. Our home has been threatened, our privacy invaded, our children's sense of security compromised." Zora's eyes moved from Elaine to the university administrators. "I want to be clear that none of this was our choice. We didn't ask for a viral moment or institutional intervention. We simply asked for respect." The weight of her words settled over the table. One of the administrators scribbled notes while the other maintained careful eye contact. "Thank you, Zora," Dr. Chen said. "Elaine, are you ready to share your perspective?" Elaine cleared her throat, her fingers nervously adjusting a silver bracelet. "First, I want to say that She hesitated, seemingly struggling with the words. "I apologize for the disruption I caused to your gathering." The careful phrasing, apologizing for disruption rather than bias or harm, wasn't lost on anyone. "I've been the neighborhood watch coordinator for 7 years," she continued. "In that time we've had break-ins, vandalism, and unauthorized use of vacant properties. My intention was to protect the neighborhood, not to..." She paused again. "Not to make anyone feel unwelcome." Marcus noted the passive construction. Make anyone feel unwelcome, rather than act unwelcomingly. "The aftermath has been devastating," Elaine said, her voice tightening. "I've been suspended from my position here. I've lost real estate clients. I've received threats. My reputation has been destroyed by a 3-minute video that doesn't show my 15 years of commitment to this community." James placed a hand on his mother's arm. Support and gentle restraint combined. I never intended for any of this to happen, Elaine concluded, a note of genuine distress finally breaking through her composed facade. Dr. Chen nodded. Thank you for sharing, Elaine. James, would you like to speak next? James straightened, his expression a complex mixture of emotions. I want to start by apologizing to the Robinson family, he said, his voice clearer and more direct than his mother's had been. What happened was wrong, and I'm sorry my mother's actions caused you pain. Elaine stiffened beside him, but he continued. I've spent the past 2 years at Berkeley studying structural inequality and systemic racism. I've written papers and attended protests about the exact dynamics that played out in your backyard. His voice caught slightly. And then suddenly, it was my mother in that viral video. The same mother who taught me to stand up for what's right. He turned slightly toward Elaine. I love my mom. She's worked incredibly hard as a single parent after my dad left. But love doesn't mean ignoring harmful actions. It means holding each other accountable so we can be better. The raw honesty of his statement created the first authentic moment of the session. Even the administrators had stopped taking notes, caught by the emotional current of his words. This has forced conversations we should have had years ago, James finished. Painful, necessary conversations about privilege and perception that I hope will lead to genuine change, not just damage control. Marcus found himself unexpectedly moved by the young man's courage. Walter spoke next, providing historical context about the neighborhood's transformation that framed the incident within decades of shifting boundaries and power dynamics. His gentle wisdom offered breathing room from the intense personal testimonies. As Walter finished, the door to the conference room opened quietly. Carmen Diaz slipped in, nodding apologetically to Dr. Chen, who looked momentarily flustered by the unscheduled addition. I'm sorry I'm late, Carmen said softly. The bus was delayed. Zora had known Carmen was considering attending, but hadn't been certain she would come. She moved her chair slightly to make room at the table. You must be Carmen Diaz, Dr. Chen said, recovering quickly. We received your request to join but weren't sure you'd be able to attend. Please take a seat. Carmen sat between Zora and Walter, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I felt I needed to be here, she said. My story is part of this too. Dr. Chen nodded encouragingly. Would you like to share your perspective? Carmen took a deep breath. When the police arrived at the barbecue, I was terrified. Not because I had done anything wrong, but because I am undocumented. Her voice trembled slightly but grew stronger as she continued. I moved my children inside immediately. I prayed no one would ask for my identification. Elaine's eyes widened, slightly. Whether at the revelation itself or at Carmen's courage in making it was unclear. The Robinsons have been kind neighbors and friends, Carmen continued. They blurred my face in the video to protect me. But this incident shows how quickly one person's assumptions can endanger others in ways they don't even consider. She looked directly at Elaine. When you called the police, you weren't thinking about mothers who might be separated from their children because of a barbecue. You weren't thinking about families being torn apart. You were only thinking about who belonged and who didn't, based on what they looked like. The administrators exchanged glances, clearly recognizing the additional complexity Carmen's testimony added to what they had likely hoped would be a contained institutional matter. Thank you for your courage in sharing this, Ms. Diaz, Dr. Chen said. Your perspective adds an important dimension to our understanding. After a short break during which the participants dispersed to separate corners of the room, Dr. Chen reconvened the group. Now I'd like us to move toward resolution. The university has drafted a proposed path forward. One of the administrators distributed folders containing printed materials. We're proposing a 3-part approach, she explained. First, a formal acknowledgement of harm. Second, an educational component where Elaine would participate in our inclusive community training program. And third, a community education initiative using this case study, anonymized, of course, as a teaching tool for our public policy students. Marcus flipped through the materials with growing skepticism. The university's proposal was perfectly reasonable, professionally designed, and utterly divorced from the human reality of their situation. "May I speak candidly?" he asked, setting the folder aside. Dr. Chen nodded. "Of course. This feels like it's designed to protect the university, more than address what happened between us as neighbors," Marcus said. "These training programs and case studies, they're valuable, I'm sure, but they don't address the fact that our children will still play on the same streets, that we'll still pass each other at the grocery store, that our lives will continue to intersect long after this meeting ends." Zora placed her hand on his arm, a gesture that could have been support or caution. "I agree," James said unexpectedly. "This feels bureaucratic rather than human." Dr. Chen looked between them. "What would a more meaningful resolution look like to you?" Before Marcus could respond, a staff member entered and whispered something to one of the administrators, who then excused herself from the room. In the momentary disruption, Marcus found himself making unexpected eye contact with Elaine. Without the mediator's facilitation, without the institutional framework, just two people caught in a situation neither had fully anticipated. "Could we speak privately?" he asked her quietly as the others discussed something about scheduling. "But love doesn't mean ignoring harmful actions. It means holding each other accountable so we can be better." The raw honesty of his statement created the first authentic moment of the session. Even the administrators had stopped taking notes, caught by the emotional current of his words. "This has forced conversations we should have had years ago," James finished. "Painful, necessary conversations about privilege and perception that I hope will lead to genuine change, not just damage control." Marcus found himself unexpectedly moved by the young man's courage. Walter spoke next, providing historical context about the neighborhood's transformation that framed the incident within decades of shifting boundaries and power dynamics. His gentle wisdom offered breathing room from the intense personal testimonies. As Walter finished, the door to the conference room opened quietly. Carmen Diaz slipped in, nodding apologetically to Dr. Chen, who looked momentarily flustered by the unscheduled addition. "I'm sorry I'm late," Carmen said softly. "The bus was delayed." Zora had known Carmen was considering attending but hadn't been certain she would come. She moved her chair slightly to make room at the table. "You must be Carmen Diaz," Dr. Chen said, recovering quickly. "We received your request to join but weren't sure you'd be able to attend. Please take a seat." Carmen sat between Zora and Walter, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I felt I needed to be here," she said. "My story is part of this too." Dr. Chen nodded encouragingly. "Would you like to share your perspective?" Carmen took a deep breath. "When the police arrived at the barbecue, I was terrified. Not because I had done anything wrong, but because I am undocumented." Her voice trembled slightly but grew stronger as she continued. "I moved my children inside immediately. I prayed no one would ask for my identification." Elaine's eyes widened, slightly. Whether at the revelation itself or at Carmen's courage in making it was unclear. "The Robinsons have been kind neighbors and friends," Carmen continued. "They blurred my face in the video to protect me, but this incident shows how quickly one person's assumptions can endanger others in ways they don't even consider." She looked directly at Elaine. "When you called the police, you weren't thinking about mothers who might be separated from their children because of a barbecue. You weren't thinking about families being torn apart. You were only thinking about who belonged and who didn't based on what they looked like." The administrators exchanged glances, clearly recognizing the additional complexity Carmen's testimony added to what they had likely hoped would be a contained institutional matter. "Thank you for your courage in sharing this, Ms. Diaz, Dr. Chen said. "Your perspective adds an important dimension to our understanding." After a short break, during which the participants dispersed to separate corners of the room, Dr. Chen reconvened the group. "Now I'd like us to move toward resolution. The university has drafted a proposed path forward." One of the administrators distributed folders containing printed materials. "We're proposing a three-part approach," she explained. "First, a formal acknowledgement of harm. Second, an educational component where Elaine would participate in our inclusive community training program. And third, a community education initiative using this case study, anonymized of course, as a teaching tool for our public policy students. Marcus flipped through the materials with growing skepticism. The university's proposal was perfectly reasonable, professionally designed, and utterly divorced from the human reality of their situation. "May I speak candidly?" he asked, setting the folder aside. Dr. Chen nodded. "Of course. This feels like it's designed to protect the university, more than address what happened between us as neighbors," Marcus said. "These training programs and case studies, they're valuable, I'm sure, but they don't address the fact that our children will still play on the same streets, that we'll still pass each other at the grocery store, that our lives will continue to intersect long after this meeting ends." Zora placed her hand on his arm, a gesture that could have been support or caution. "I agree," James said unexpectedly. "This feels bureaucratic rather than human." Dr. Chen looked between them. "What would a more meaningful resolution look like to you?" Before Marcus could respond, a staff member entered and whispered something to one of the administrators, who then excused herself from the room. In the momentary disruption, Marcus found himself making unexpected eye contact with Elaine. Without the mediator's facilitation, without the institutional framework, just two people caught in a situation neither had fully anticipated. "Could we speak privately?" he asked her quietly, as the others discussed something about scheduling. The answer came in flashing red and blue lights pulsing through their bedroom window. Marcus crossed to the glass and pulled back the curtain. 2 streets over, orange flames licked skyward. Fire trucks were already on scene, but another raced past their house, siren wailing. "Fire," he said tersely. "Close. Get the kids." They moved with the efficiency of parents accustomed to emergencies. Zora to Isaiah's room, Marcus to Amara's. Within minutes, they had assembled in the hallway, children bleary-eyed and confused. "Is our house on fire?" Amara asked, clutching her stuffed rabbit. "No, sweetheart, but a house nearby is," Marcus explained, guiding them toward the stairs. "We need to go outside just to be safe." Carmen emerged from the guest room where she'd been staying temporarily. "What's happening?" "Fire on the block," Zora explained. "Grab your documents." They were halfway down the stairs when pounding came at their front door. Marcus opened it to find a firefighter in full gear. "Mandatory evacuation," he announced. "The fire at 1829 has spread to the electrical system. Potential for a utility line explosion. Everyone needs to move to the evacuation point at the park, now." 1829? That's 2 doors down from Elaine, Marcus said, the layout of their block suddenly vivid in his mind. Outside, chaos had transformed their quiet street. Neighbors spilled, from homes in various states of undress. Fire trucks created a barricade at one end of the block, their lights casting everything in alternating red and blue shadows. The acrid smell of electrical fire hung in the air. The Robinsons joined the stream of residents moving toward the park. At the designated evacuation area, families clustered in worried groups. Marcus immediately looked for Walter, finding the elderly man sitting on a park bench, a blanket around his shoulders and a worrying wheeze in his breathing. "Walter, are you all right?" Marcus asked, crouching beside him. "Smoke," Walter managed, his voice raspy. "Got a bit turned around leaving the house." Marcus signaled to a nearby paramedic, who moved toward them with an oxygen tank. As he stood, Marcus found himself face to face with Elaine Whitfield. She wore a light blue robe over striped pajamas, her silver-streaked hair loose around her shoulders. Without makeup and professional attire, she looked vulnerable, simply a frightened neighbor rather than an adversary. For a moment, they stared at each other, the artificial formality of their university meeting stripped away by the midnight emergency. "Is your house affected?" Marcus finally asked. Elaine's composure wavered. "The firefighters think so. The electrical fire spread through the shared utility connection. They said there might be structural damage to my back section." James appeared, beside his mother carrying 2 cups of coffee from a community aid station. "They're not letting anyone back yet," he reported, then noticed Marcus. "Oh, hello." The awkwardness of their last meeting hung briefly in the air, then dissipated in the face of more immediate concerns. They're treating Walter for smoke inhalation, Marcus said, gesturing to where the paramedic was fitting an oxygen mask over the elderly man's face. Poor Walter, Elaine said with genuine concern. He's been having mobility issues lately. Zora approached with Amara and Isaiah, who were now fully awake. Carmen had stayed with the paramedics, helping translate for an elderly Spanish-speaking couple. The fire chief says it might be a while before we can return, Zora reported. They're worried about gas lines. Amara tugged at her father's sleeve. Dad, is our house going to burn down? Marcus knelt to his daughter's level. No, sweetheart. The firefighters are working very hard to make sure all our homes are safe. What about Ms. Whitfield's house? Amara asked, looking directly at Elaine. Is her house okay? They think there might be some damage, Elaine answered, her voice gentler than Marcus had ever heard it. That's sad, Amara said simply. Where will you sleep? The innocent question highlighted a practical reality the adults had been too preoccupied to consider. A firefighter approached with a clipboard. We need to do a quick resident check. Names and addresses? After they provided their information, the firefighter glanced down at his list. Whitfield and Robinson, from 1835 and 1837? He looked between them with sudden recognition. Wait, aren't you the… Yes, Marcus interrupted firmly. Is there any update on when we might return home? We're allowing brief re-entry for essentials only. 1 person per household, escorted by fire personnel. 5 minutes maximum. I'll go, Marcus said immediately. Me too, James volunteered. The firefighter led them toward the barricade, explaining safety protocols. James fell into step beside Marcus. This is surreal, the young man muttered. A month ago, my mother was calling the police on your family. Now we're all standing around in our pajamas while our houses might be burning. Crisis has a way of reordering priorities, Marcus replied. They were escorted first to the Robinsons' home, which appeared untouched save for the acrid smell. Marcus quickly gathered medications, the children's comfort items, and their external hard drive. The Whitfield house had fared worse. The back portion had sustained visible damage, with broken windows and charred siding. Inside, the smell of smoke was stronger. James moved quickly to gather his mother's medications and purse, then hesitated at her closet. She has a fireproof box with her documents, he explained, but I don't know the combination. What about irreplaceables? Marcus suggested. Photos, mementos? The albums. They're in the hallway bookcase. The firefighter checked his watch. 2 minutes left. Marcus found himself helping James gather several photo albums. The top album had fallen open, revealing a much younger Elaine in a graduation cap and gown, her smile wide and hopeful. A human life, documented. Not so different from the albums Zora meticulously maintained for their own children. Outside, they found their families sitting together on adjacent benches. Elaine's expression when she saw the photo albums was nakedly emotional, relief washing away her careful facade. My albums, she said, reaching for them. You remembered. Actually, James said, it was Marcus's suggestion. Elaine looked up, genuine surprise registering. Thank you, she said simply. A fire department official approached. Ms. Whitfield, I need to speak with you about your property. Elaine moved away with the official, James following. When they returned, the news was evident in their expressions. The back section of the house is structurally compromised, James explained. There's also significant smoke and water damage throughout the first floor. It's uninhabitable for at least a few weeks. My insurance will cover a hotel, Elaine said quickly, though her voice lacked conviction. Where will you stay tonight? Zora asked, the practical question cutting through social awkwardness. I'm sure there's a hotel that can accommodate us even at this hour. With all your things smelling of smoke with no change of clothes? Zora pressed gently. A moment of silence followed, heavy with unspoken history. Our guest room is available, Marcus said, the offer surprising even himself. Carmen has been using it, but she could move to the office futon for a night or two. Carmen nodded immediately. Of course, it's no problem. The shock on Elaine's face would have been comical in any other circumstance. I couldn't possibly. It's just a place to sleep, Zora interjected. Nothing more, nothing less, until you can make other arrangements. James looked between the families, understanding the magnitude of what was being offered. Considering we're neighbors, Marcus said, and this is what neighbors do in a crisis. Elaine's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. Tears welled in her eyes, though she blinked them back. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible. "Just for tonight." It was nearly 4 a.m. when they were finally allowed to return to their homes. The Robinsons led the way, Elaine and James following with their salvaged possessions. The house felt different with their former adversary crossing the threshold, not as an intruder this time, but as an invited guest. The children, exhausted, were settled back into their beds. Carmen helped prepare the guest room, efficiently changing sheets and finding spare toiletries. James took the sofa in the living room, accepting a pillow and blanket from Zora with genuine gratitude. As the house settled into uneasy quiet, Marcus and Zora retreated to their bedroom. "Are we crazy for doing this?" Marcus asked, sitting on the edge of their bed. "Inviting Elaine Whitfield, the woman who called the police on our family, to stay under our roof." "Maybe," Zora considered, "but it felt like the right thing to do." "It did," Marcus agreed. "I'm just not sure why." "Because we're not who she thought we were," Zora suggested. "And maybe she's not entirely who we thought she was either." Downstairs, unable to sleep, Elaine had made her way to the kitchen for water. She stood at the sink looking out at the yard where just over a month ago, she had disrupted a family celebration with accusations and suspicion. From this vantage point, she could see the careful landscaping, the children's swing set, the herb garden starting to flourish. Signs of care, of permanence, of belonging. All the things she had refused to see that day. "Can't sleep?" She turned to find Zora in the doorway, wrapped in a robe. "I'm sorry if I woke you," Elaine said. "You didn't." Crisis adrenaline. Zora moved to the cabinet, removing 2 mugs. "Tea helps sometimes. Would you like some?" The domestic normality of the offer created a surreal moment of connection. As Zora prepared the tea, silence stretched between them. Not comfortable, but not hostile either. "Your home is lovely," Elaine finally said. "The restoration work is exceptional. We worked with an architectural historian to ensure historical accuracy while updating the systems." "I did the same when I purchased mine," Elaine said. 15 years ago, these Victorians were still considered white elephants, beautiful but impractical." "What drew you to yours?" Zora asked, handing Elaine a steaming mug. The question seemed to surprise Elaine. "Security," she admitted after a moment. "I was going through a difficult divorce. My ex-husband controlled our finances, our social circle, even our daily routines. The house was the first thing that was fully mine." Zora nodded, understanding evident. "So when you thought it was being threatened—" "I overreacted," Elaine finished. "I perceived a threat where there wasn't one." The simple acknowledgement hung in the air between them. "I'm not excusing what I did," Elaine continued, her voice soft but steady. "Just trying to understand it better myself." "Understanding is a start," Zora said. They sipped their tea in silence, the kitchen clock ticking softly. Through the window, they could see the first hint of dawn lightening the eastern sky. "Your friend Carmen," Elaine said hesitantly. "At the university meeting, when she said she was undocumented. I had no idea when I called the police that day." "Most people don't consider the ripple effects of their actions," Zora replied. "That's part of privilege, not having to think about how systems might harm others differently." Elaine nodded slowly. "I've been doing a lot of reading since everything. James has suggested books, articles. It's been educational." "Painful too, I imagine," Zora observed. "Yes," Elaine admitted. "Recognizing yourself in unflattering examples isn't pleasant." For the first time, a hint of genuine connection flickered between them. Professional women who valued precision and control, who protected what mattered to them, who were capable of growth even when it hurt. Morning brought a flurry of activity. Insurance adjusters arrived to assess damage. Restoration companies were called. The Red Cross set up a station for affected residents. News crews appeared, eager to document the fire's impact. It didn't take long for someone to make the connection. "Aren't those the houses from that viral video?" a reporter asked, gesturing toward the Robinson and Whitfield properties. "The Oakland Karen incident?" The question spread, cameras suddenly turning toward Marcus and Elaine as they spoke with their respective insurance agents on the sidewalk. "Mr. Robinson, Ms. Whitfield, Channel 7 News, can we get a statement about the fire and your current living situation?" Marcus felt a familiar tension return to his shoulders. The crisis-induced truce was about to be tested by the harsh spotlight of public scrutiny. But before either could respond, Walter stepped forward, his presence commanding despite the oxygen cannula still in his nostrils. "This neighborhood has faced bigger challenges than a utility fire," he announced firmly. "What you're seeing here isn't about viral videos or social media stories. It's about community resilience. Now, if you'll excuse us, we have homes to repair and lives to rebuild." He gestured for Marcus and Elaine to follow him, creating a physical barrier between them and the press. Inside, they found their children sharing breakfast at the kitchen table. Isaiah and Amara teaching James how to play their made-up card game, Carmen making pancakes, Zora on the phone with her law office. The scene was strikingly domestic, not the formal, facilitated interaction of the university meeting, but the organic connection of humans sharing space and immediate purpose. "The restoration company can start work tomorrow," Elaine announced. "They estimate 2 to 3 weeks for the structural repairs. You're welcome to stay until you find suitable arrangements," Marcus said. The offer made casually, as if extending hospitality to a former adversary was the most natural thing in the world. Elaine looked around at the improbable tableau, her son laughing with the Robinson children, Carmen serving breakfast in a kitchen not her own, Walter settling in a chair by the window. "Thank you," she said, her voice holding none of the defensive pride that had characterized their previous interactions. "I think I'd like to take you up on that, just until the hotel arrangements are finalized." It wasn't friendship. It wasn't even reconciliation in any formal sense. But it was something real, a crisis-forged connection that had revealed the artificial nature of the boundaries they had constructed between their lives. Outside, the smell of smoke still hung in the air, a reminder of how quickly security could be threatened. But inside, a different kind of rebuilding had begun. One measured not in structural repairs or insurance claims, but in small moments of shared humanity across lines that had once seemed impassable. The late summer sun cast long shadows across the Robinson backyard, gilding the edges of the Victorian rooflines and warming the new bluestone patio where Marcus turned skewers on the refurbished grill. 6 months had passed since the fire, and the neighborhood had settled into a different rhythm. Not the wary coexistence of before, nor the forced intimacy of crisis, but something deliberately crafted between those extremes. "Dad, Ms. Whitfield, wants to know if the herb arrangement looks right," Amara called from the side yard where the fence line had been reimagined. What had once been a solid barrier between properties now featured a shared garden space. A wooden pergola, framing a stone path with raised beds on either side, rosemary and sage spilling over decorative borders that marked territory without sealing it off completely. Marcus smiled at the question, so quintessentially Elaine in its concern for precision, yet wrapped in a collaborative framework that would have been unimaginable a year earlier. "Tell her the symmetry is perfect," he replied. Zora emerged from the house carrying a tray of drinks, legal pads tucked under her arm. "The community land trust proposal is ready for review," she announced. "Walter thinks we should present it at the neighborhood association meeting next month." "Elaine's on board?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. "It was half her idea," Zora replied, setting down the tray. "She knows more about real estate law than I expected. Her experience on the Historical Preservation Board has been surprisingly useful." The unlikely alliance between his wife and their former antagonist still occasionally caught Marcus off guard. The two professional women had discovered shared concerns about housing equity during Elaine's brief stay after the fire, and their cautious cooperation had gradually evolved into a genuine working relationship. Their joint initiative aimed to create permanently affordable housing in the neighborhood through a community land trust model, combining Zora's civil rights expertise with Elaine's deep knowledge of local property regulations. The article about their initiative comes out in the Chronicle next week, Carmen said, joining them with a bowl of marinated vegetables for the grill. Her English had grown more confident over the past months as she'd stepped into a community leadership role, working with the immigration rights organization that had initially approached her. They want to do a follow-up about the neighborhood. Transformation. I told them transformations take longer than news cycles. Marcus exchanged a knowing look with Carmen. They both understood the gap between media narratives and lived realities, how headlines demanded neat resolutions, while actual human communities moved in fits and starts, with progress and regression often coexisting. Speaking of media, Zora said, checking her phone, Channel 7 called again about their 1 year later segment. I declined. Some stories don't need epilogues for public consumption. Marcus nodded his agreement. The viral moment that had thrust them unwillingly into the spotlight had faded from public attention as newer controversies emerged, but occasional flare-ups of interest still appeared. Journalists seeking to package their complex experience into digestible content. The gate opened, and Walter entered with his newest acquisition, a motorized scooter that allowed him to lead his increasingly popular neighborhood history tours despite his mobility challenges. The tour group loved the garden transition, he reported, parking his scooter at the edge of the patio. I told them how it symbolizes the neighborhood's approach to change, honoring boundaries while creating connection points. At 88, Walter had become something of a local celebrity. His decades of observations about Oakland's evolution in demand as the city struggled with its identity amid continued gentrification. His tours now included the story of the Robinson-Whitfield fence line as a metaphor for the complex navigation of shared urban space. Were they disappointed there was no drama to photograph? Zora asked wryly. Walter chuckled. Some were. People want fireworks, confrontation or kumbaya moment. The messy middle doesn't make for good Instagram. The messy middle, the phrase, captured their reality perfectly. In the months since the fire, both families had discovered that genuine reconciliation wasn't a single moment of breakthrough, but a series of small choices, sometimes awkward, occasionally rewarding, always requiring conscious effort. The sound of children's laughter drew their attention to the far corner of the yard, where Isaiah and Miguel were helping James set up a science demonstration table for the younger neighborhood kids. James had returned from Berkeley for the summer, with a community education initiative focused on STEM outreach in gentrifying areas. My professors didn't quite get it, he had explained to Marcus when proposing the program. They wanted me focusing on policy papers and protest organizing. But I keep thinking about how movements need to be rooted in actual relationships to create lasting change. Now James looked up and waved, his expression containing none of the wary tension that had characterized his earlier interactions with the Robinsons. 6 months of regular contact, first through the forced proximity after the fire, then through deliberately maintained connections, had transformed him from an awkward intermediary to a comfortable presence in their lives. Elaine emerged from the side yard, clipboard in hand. Some habits remained unchanged despite her evolution. The herb garden is ready, she announced, checking off an item on her list. And I've labeled everything in both English and Spanish, as Carmen suggested. Her gaze drifted to where her son worked with the children, a complex mixture of emotions crossing her face. Their relationship had been fundamentally altered by the viral incident and its aftermath. Painful growth that had ultimately strengthened their connection rather than severing it. The neighborhood association unanimously approved the block party permit, she continued. Even the Hendersons, and they vote against everything. Marcus smiled at this evidence of Elaine's unchanged nature, still detail-oriented, still invested in neighborhood protocols, channeled now into more collaborative endeavors. She remained Elaine Whitfield with all her particular quirks and perspectives, but the rigid boundaries she had once enforced had softened into more permeable lines. As afternoon mellowed toward evening, the yard gradually filled with neighbors, some from the original barbecue that had ended so disastrously, others new to the gathering. The mix reflected the neighborhood itself, longtime residents alongside newcomers, multiple languages mingling in conversation clusters, children forming fluid playgroups that ignored the adult categories of homeowner versus renter, old-timer versus gentrifier. Officer Ramirez arrived in civilian clothes, his wife and daughter accompanying him. He greeted Marcus with a handshake that had evolved into something warmer over intervening months. The department implemented the new protocols last week, he reported. All officers responding to neighborhood disputes now receive specific training about the historical context of housing discrimination and the proper handling of boundary conflicts. Your body camera footage was instrumental in designing the training, his wife added, though they don't mention you by name. Marcus nodded, appreciating the systemic impact while preferring the personal anonymity. Training helps, but individual, officers making thoughtful choices matters more. Like you did that day? Zora added, joining them. Ramirez shrugged modestly. My mother still lives in her Fruitvale house because neighbors looked out for each other when outsiders tried to pressure sales. I understand something about community boundaries. The conversation shifted to lighter topics as more guests arrived. Marcus moved through his role as host with growing ease, no longer feeling the pressure to prove his belonging that had characterized their first gathering. This home, this yard, this neighborhood, all had become more securely his, not through legal documentation alone, but through the accumulated patterns of daily life. Near the newly installed fire pit, Walter had gathered a group of children for storytelling, his deep voice carrying as he shared tales of the neighborhood's past, the jazz clubs that had once lined nearby streets, the civil rights meetings held in now renovated Victorians, the block parties that had sustained community through economic downturns. History isn't just in books, he told his rapt audience. It's in the buildings around us, the gardens we plant, the relationships we build or break. You're part of this story now, adding your own chapters. Amara sat cross-legged at the front of the group, recording Walter's stories on her tablet, a project she had started after learning that no formal archive of neighborhood oral histories existed. At 12, she had appointed herself keeper of local memory, interviewing elderly residents with earnest determination. Mr. Walter, she asked, was the neighborhood always divided, or did people used to get along better? The deceptively simple question created a ripple of adult attention around the circle. Walter considered his answer carefully. Both, he said finally. There have always been divisions, race, class, newcomer versus old-timer. But there have always been connections too, shared concerns about safety, children's education, property upkeep. The boundaries shift, but never disappear completely. Elaine, who had been arranging desserts nearby, paused in her work to listen. The healthiest neighborhoods, Walter continued, aren't the ones without boundaries, but the ones where the boundaries are acknowledged honestly and crossed intentionally. His gaze drifted toward the modified fence line with its garden transition space, physical embodiment of the philosophy he described. As twilight deepened, Marcus activated the newly installed string lights that canopied the yard, transforming the gathering with a warm glow. The security cameras that had captured the fateful confrontation a year earlier still maintained their silent watch, but their purpose had evolved from vigilant protection to routine precaution. Zora found him by the grill, sliding her arm around his waist. It's working, she said quietly. What is? Marcus asked. This experiment in belonging, she replied. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to matter. He followed her gaze across the yard where Carmen's daughter was teaching Elaine a hand-clapping game, the formal neighbor and the undocumented mother finding common ground in their mutual affection for children. Nearby, James engaged Walter in an animated discussion about urban planning history, while Officer Ramirez's daughter played tag with Isaiah and the other neighborhood kids. We didn't solve racism or gentrification, Marcus observed, echoing Zora's clear-eyed assessment. Those forces are still at work all around us. But we carved out a space where we can acknowledge them honestly, Zora completed the thought, where we can work on the boundaries together instead of against each other. As the evening progressed, a spontaneous talent show emerged. Neighborhood children performing songs, magic tricks, and dance routines on the patio turned stage. When Miguel became overwhelmed by stage fright during his planned magic performance, James stepped in as an assistant, gently guiding the boy through the routine with encouraging whispers. Watching this small moment of intergenerational care, Marcus felt a complex emotion he couldn't immediately name. Something beyond satisfaction, but short of triumph. A quiet recognition that their painful journey had yielded fragile but genuine fruit. Later, as the party began to wind down, Walter called for everyone's attention. "Before we lose the light completely, I think we should take a neighborhood photo," he suggested, "for the historical record." The group assembled on the lawn, arranging themselves with the Victorian homes as backdrop. Walter set up his camera on a tripod, then used his scooter to join the gathering. "Everyone say community," he called. "Community," came the ragged chorus, followed by laughter. The camera flashed, capturing the imperfect assembly. Not a choreographed image of diversity for institutional brochures, but a genuine moment of people occupying shared space with all their differences visible, yet not divisive. As guests began to depart, Elaine approached Marcus, her expression thoughtful. "I've been meaning to tell you something," she said. "When you helped James rescue my photo albums during the fire, that changed something for me. Not everything, but something important." The simple acknowledgement required no response. Marcus simply nodded, recognizing the courage it took for her to articulate the shift. "I still think the historical character of this neighborhood matters," Elaine continued. "But I understand now that preservation isn't just about buildings. It's about the people and their stories too." "All the people," Marcus said gently. "Yes," Elaine agreed. "All of them." It wasn't a perfect resolution, not the neat closure that media narratives demanded. Elaine would always be Elaine, with her clipboard and concerns about property values. The socio-economic forces transforming Oakland remained in motion all around them. The work of creating genuine community across difference would require ongoing attention and care. But something had shifted fundamentally in how they occupied shared space, from defensive territoriality to cautious stewardship, from rigid barriers to more permeable boundaries that allowed for both protection and connection. As the last guest departed, Marcus found himself standing at the edge of the yard where the traditional fence gave way to the garden transition space. From this vantage point, he could see both properties simultaneously, distinct yet connected, separate but in conversation with each other. The security camera above the gate blinked its red light, recording not confrontation this time but the aftermath of connection. The yard bearing evidence of shared food and conversation, the modified boundary line with its intentional openings, the imperfect but genuine attempt to create belonging across difference. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The housing market would continue its relentless pressure. Implicit biases would still require conscious counteraction. The delicate balance they had achieved would need ongoing maintenance and adjustment. But tonight, in this yard where pain and healing had both occurred, Marcus felt a quiet assurance that boundaries could be both real and permeable, that they could mark necessary distinctions while still allowing for essential connections. As he turned to go inside, he glanced once more at the fence line with its garden transition. Neither a wall nor an erasure of difference, but something more complex and truthful, a boundary that acknowledged separation while creating intentional points of crossing. Like the neighborhood itself, like the city around them, like the country they all called home. The work would always be unfinished, the balance never perfect, the belonging always partial and in process. But tonight that felt like enough, not an ending, but a more hopeful way of continuing. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.